So the event is now being recorded. Second, once the lecture ends, we will be moving on to a Q&A, which should last around 15 to 20 minutes. If you wish me to ask a question for you, you can write your question down at any point during the webinar by typing it into the Q&A window at the bottom. This is not the chat function. This is specifically the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. This function not only enables you to type questions, but also allows you to upvote questions that you find interesting or that you want to be answered, making it more likely for those questions to be asked. Lastly, I'll also be giving an option after the lecture ends and during the start of the Q&A session for people to ask questions live. Please raise your virtual hand if you wish to do so, and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question yourself. Okay, so moving on to the event, we are very lucky to have Professor Raven from the UCL Department of Economics with us today, who has very kindly accepted to introduce our guest speaker. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor Raven.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for asking me to introduce Greg Mankiw. Greg Mankiw is the Robert Barron Professor at Harvard University, and I think last year, almost exactly at this time, I was introducing another Cambridge giant, Oliver Blanchard. So I must really congratulate the UCL Economist Society for the ability to attract speakers of this caliber to this conference. Yeah, so it's hard to pay due respect to Greg Mankiw's contributions to the discipline in a short introduction here. But let me just try and point out three different aspects of his contributions to the profession. The first level of contribution that he has made is, of course, as an academic, and you know, in an academic's career, it's rare that you get one great idea. Getting two is extremely rare, but getting many more than that. That is something that you see only very few people. But Greg Mankiw is one of those. So just to mention a few of his academic contributions to economics. So he's one of the fathers of New Keynesian economics. A classic paper is a paper on small menu cost and large business cycles, QD 1985. It's a paper I often go back and read. It's a really insightful paper about how, in the face of very small frictions, in this case, in price setting, you might have a private incentive to do things that turn out to have very large consequences for the aggregate economy. It's a question that was hotly debated in 1980s, 1990s, but I think these days it's much less controversial, and younger economists, they are using these ideas a lot. He actually later came up with another idea of how to think about how you can get these kind of new Keynesian effects in the aggregate economy in the paper joined with Ricardo Reis about the sticky information. So in his original work, it was about how there might be impediments to changing prices that they may be small but can have large effects. In this later work, instead, the idea is that maybe you don't always collect information that makes you do the right thing, so to say. In both cases, of course, that motivates stabilization policy, which I guess is something he will talk about today. On top of that, he is also one of the fathers of the empirical growth literature, and a very insightful and important paper is the contribution to the empirics of growth, QD 92, with the 2 times David, Roma, and Weil. And this paper, that paper is also another paper that I think is very insightful and one should go back and read from time to time. So it basically launches the idea that human capital is an important factor in accounting for income differences across countries. Another paper that is close to my heart as well is a paper on liquidity constraints and the impact on consumption choices. Paper with John Campbell about in which they launched the idea of rule of thumb consumers and showed how this might be important for aggregate outcomes. That is a topic that is attracting a huge amount of interest in these days in slightly different models, but going back to the idea of liquidity constraints. And then, of course, another piece of work that also these days is getting a lot of attention is the work on disagreement about, in this case, about the, inflation expectations. So another paper joined with Ricardo Rice, in this case, also Justin Wolfers, published in the NBR Macro Annual in 2003. So these are just 5 examples of really fundamental contributions he's made to the literature, but there are many more than those. He is one of those that have changed the way we do work in macroeconomics, but also he has worked on other fields on top of this. So really a giant in terms of academic contributions. But of course, he is also a giant in terms of impact on policy and public engagement. So I think in between doing his undergraduate degree and going to grad school, he worked as staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, and then he came back and took on what is probably the most important type of job in terms of advising policy in the United States, namely being the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush in 2003 to 5. A couple of the things that you might notice that the sort of stood for them was one was the support for free trade, which I think is an important thing to speak up for, and certainly one that was also controversial. And then in very forward-looking, insightful work, he also proposed regulatory reform of the agencies, Fannie and Freddie Mae, well ahead of financial crisis, policies that unfortunately weren't adopted until it was probably too late. Also well known as proponent of carbon taxes, of course, something that's enormously discussed these days. And later on, he was an advisor to Mitt Romney, including during his presidential campaign. So huge impact on policy, but also on public engagement. So I would encourage everybody to occasionally look at his blog. It's really, really insightful and also entertaining. And I know many academic economists like myself, we check this very regularly. So another giant in terms of the policy and public engagement, but of course also education. So Greg is a mythical teacher on the introductory economics at Harvard College. I know personally many people who have taken his introductory economics course and really start burning for the field. And beyond that, then wider circles then of course are extremely well known for the textbooks and the principle of economics, and the macroeconomics, the intermediary macroeconomics textbook. So another dimension to what he has done for the profession comes through education, something that also you will feel quite strongly about, that is something we should do. So major achievements in science and policy, communication, education. Also, I should say that he's not known for pulling his punches, so I think it could be an entertaining talk today. So there are famous debates between what was known as salt and freshwater macroeconomics or economics in the 1980s and 1990s that he was involved in, and of course also well known for bust up with Trump. So with that, let me stop here and hand over to Greg, and I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say today.
Well, thank you. That is a very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. What I'd like to do is talk to you about a topic that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and I think quite a few macroeconomists have, and it's how do we think about macroeconomic policy? And I'm going to tend to focus on fiscal policy. It'll have a little to say about monetary policy. How do we think about fiscal policy in the context of having very low interest rates? And this is sort of true around the world, but the data I'm going to show you is for the United States. So I want to try to share my screen, and please let me know if I fail. in this regard. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can see
Yes,
it.
you can. Good. Okay. So I'm going to look over here. So I have this other map. If I'm looking over there, it's because my screen is over there. So anyway, so what I want to talk about is macroeconomic policy at a time of low interest rates. And one way to start thinking about this is so this graph here. This is shows your sort of standard debt to GDP ratio, which you've sort of seen lots of places. This sort of fluctuates over time. It reached sort of a high, you don't see in this graph, but it reached a high just after World War II, and then sort of came down during World War II, and then sort of fluctuated a lot over different periods of time. And you see different periods. You sort of see the Reagan buildup, debt buildup, which you see here. Here you see the buildup due to the financial crisis. And then towards the end here, you see a the increase associated with the pandemic, the very large spending due to the rescue basically from the COVID pandemic. And so basically now we're reaching levels of debt to GDP ratios that are close to historic highs in the United States, and they're probably going to surpass historic highs in the relatively near future. So you look at this and you say, oh my God, we have a debt problem. Debt is reaching historic levels. We should worry about that. On the other hand, if you look at this, it looks very different. This is basically the same thing we saw earlier, the debt to GDP ratio multiplied by an interest rate. Here I use the 10-year Treasury rate, but just it could have been any interest rate. And this is this is roughly speaking the debt service that the federal government needs to pay out every year as a share of GDP. And while debt is very, very high, debt service is not high at all. It's actually very low. And so some people said, look, we don't have a debt problem because debt service is really very low by historical standards, even though debt's very high. And that, of course, is the reason both those things can be true is because interest rates are very low. Part of that has to do with low inflation and nominal interest rates. But I think a large part of that, and what I want to focus on today, is low real interest rates. And here, this shows you here the real interest rate. I showed you two different measures of the real interest rate. One is the 10-year nominal interest rate minus core inflation, that is inflation less food and energy prices. And then that's the blue line. And the red line is the 10-year TIPS, which I'm including just to show that these two things are pretty similar. TIPS doesn't go back as far. But I just wanted to convince you that sort of just looking at 10-year nominal minus core inflation is not such a bad proxy for real interest rates. And what you see here is there's been a very sizable decline from the mid-'80s to today, where in the mid-'80s you saw interest rates in the ballpark of 4 or 5%, even 7%, shortly after the disinflation of the early '80s. But 4 or 5% was kind of a normal level of real interest rates, and then they sort of kept coming down, and now they're basically, well, they hit zero, now they're negative. And we have negative real interest rates. And if you can borrow at negative real interest rates, well, then borrowing looks a lot less worrisome because basically there's actually no cost to servicing the debt. And so a lot of economists have been saying that, oh, we really shouldn't worry about increases in government debt because, look, interest rates are zero, there's really no cost of borrowing, and therefore sort of budget deficits really don't, and government debt doesn't really matter much anymore. And that's what I've been thinking about. And I don't think I've come to a final resolution on this topic, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think is some of the progress I've made in terms of at least clarifying my own thinking, and maybe it'll help you clarify yours. So the kind of questions you might want to ask are, should we worry about government debt when interest rates are low? And some people, this has suggested no. And there's been some very interesting influential papers by my friends Jason Furman and Larry Summers, basically arguing that we shouldn't worry about it because debt service is not a big deal. And in addition, they argue that crowding out's not a big deal. I mean, normally we think of issuing government debt as being potentially costly to the economy because government debt crowds out private capital. And they've suggested that, that when interest rates are very low, we really shouldn't worry about crowding out private capital because capital doesn't have as much value at the margin as reflected by relatively low interest rates. Indeed, you might think in an era of low interest rates that debt has really no cost at all is that you can issue government debt and basically roll it over with the accumulating interest forever. And that because the economy grows, this rolling over of government debt at low or even negative interest rates, the debt to GDP ratio will slowly vanish. And you'll never have to raise taxes in the future to pay off that debt. Or as some of the literature puts it, the government can basically run a Ponzi scheme of basically, giving people tax cuts or doing government spending, and then never having to raise taxes in the future to pay it off. So basically roll things over. So they can do what the federal government can do what Bernie Madoff couldn't do. They're running a Ponzi scheme with government debt. Now, before we actually turn to these set of questions, and these are the first three questions are the policy questions that I'm particularly interested in answering, and a lot of people are interested in answering. But I think before we turn to that, there's a question of positive economics, not about what policy should be, but why are interest rates so low in the first place? It seems to me you should always do the positive economics before we turn to normative economics, and so that's the thing I want to turn to next with you. So why are interest rates so low in the first place? The place to start thinking about the level of interest rates, especially in the long run, is the supply and demand for loanable funds. And here I'm really thinking of what you might have learned is the IS curve, the investment savings curve in an ISLM model. So I want to assume I'm not going to worry about short-term monetary policy right now. So as I showed you earlier, this decline in real interest rates is a long-term pervasive phenomenon. So this is not just a sort of a year-to-year thing, although some of the fluctuations are, but this is really a long-term, 40-year trend we've been observing. And so I want to assume that we're in a long-term framework where the economy has left price flexibility to put people at full employment. So I'm going to think of a full employment economy and ask, why in a full employment economy might interest rates decline? And the place to start this is to thinking about savings and investment or the supply and demand for loanable funds. And this figure one that I'm showing you here is just a figure taken out of my intro textbooks. And a lot of, all good economics in some sense goes back to the principles. I think sort of, not that you can understand all economics after one course in economics, but I think a lot of good economics sort of it builds on the foundation that we set in the principles course. And this is sort of the first model of interest rates that I teach students: supply and demand for loanable funds, or think of the supplies coming from saving, the demand coming from investment, and the equilibrium interest rate is the interest rate that balances the savings and investment at full employment. Okay, so this is what's going to determine interest rates. Why interest rates are going to change? Well, they're going to change either because the savings changes and shifts the supply of loanable funds, or investment changes and changes the demand for loanable funds. And so let me sort of give you several hypotheses that can explain shifts in either of those. So I actually wrote a New York Times column back in December of 2020 saying, look, we're in this era of very low interest rates. Why is that? And I just wanted to sort of lay out for the readers what the possible hypotheses were that I had in mind. What I'm going to do for this slide is basically summarize what I said in that New York Times column. So I talked first about three things that might have shifted the supply of loanable funds and increased the supply and driving down interest rates. One is increasing inequality. We live in a time of inequality, and it's increased quite a bit since roughly the mid-70s. The timing of the shift varies, but if you look at sort of most time series, it's sometimes the mid to late 70s where inequality starts rising, and it rises pretty consistently for 20 or 30 years. I think depending what time series you look at, it's either plateaued at a high level or slightly rising still. But we certainly have a high level of inequality compared to what we've experienced historically, particularly historically compared to the 60s and 70s. High inequality tends to raise saving rates if high-income people have lower marginal propensities to consume than low-income people. So basically, take $1 from a rich person and from a poor person and give it to a rich person. The poor person is going to cut back his consumption more than the rich person is going to increase his, and therefore overall savings is going to increase, and that's going to tend to push down interest rates. So that's sort of one possible hypothesis. Another hypothesis has to do with the growth of China. Over the past several decades, China's been a very high growth economy. It also tends to be a very high saving economy. And you might think if a high saving economy grows very rapidly, that's going to increase world saving and push down world interest rates. And this was a hypothesis pushed by Ben Bernanke when he was Fed chair. He talked about the world savings glut is driving down interest rates. And whether you want to call it a glut or not, you can debate whether that's the right word, but sort of an increase in saving due to sort of growth in China could well have pushed down world interest rates. And finally, it could be also due to an increase in precautionary saving. We've lived through a period of time, we've seen some big shocks. Those big shocks could be the financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic, of the past couple of years. So if you think that people have seen some really big shocks in the past decade or so, 15 years, then you might think that precautionary saving has increased, and as people sort of worry that big shocks might be in the future as well, and that could also drive down interest rates by increasing the supply of loanable funds. In addition to that, I emphasize sort of three things that could change the demand for loanable funds, that is, reduce the demand for loans coming from investment. One is that perhaps we're in an era of slower technological progress. And there's several economists who have written about this. Probably most famously, Bob Gordon has a book called something like The Rise and Fall of American Growth, in which he argued that we're in an era of relatively low growth right now. That we certainly have inventions and we're making technological advances, but the sort of thing we're inventing now, whether it's Twitter or something else, or some other, or Instagram or TikTok, isn't as profound as the internal combustion engine, electrification, indoor plumbing, and all the things that were really life-changing in past generations. So his view is that we're in an era of lower technological growth, and that might mean reduced demand for capital to take advantage of new technologies. So that's sort of one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that we're experiencing technological progress, but of a kind that doesn't require as much capital. So if you think in the olden days when technological innovation was something like the railroad, needed the railroads to issue lots of debt to build the railroads, and that to drive up the demand for loans, and therefore drive up interest rates. Modern technological advance, the argument goes, tends to be less capital intensive. If you're Mark Zuckerberg, you don't need to build lots of things like big things like railroads. You need just a bunch of smart people in a room developing software. So this doesn't require nearly as much demand for capital. So even if we're having technological advance, we may still have less demand for capital. And the last hypothesis, which is actually the one I want to explore for most of today, is that we live in an era of increased market power. For a variety of reasons, whether it's policy or changes in technology, we live in an era that's less competitive and more monopolistic than in previous generations. Now, when we teach monopoly in the basic undergraduate classroom, the main thing we teach about monopoly is that monopolies set prices above marginal cost. And therefore reduce the quantity supplied in the market above the efficient quantity. And that's absolutely correct. But there's also a factor market's implications of that markup, which we don't often emphasize in the undergraduate classroom, but it is really just the flip side. It is that when a monopolist charges a price above marginal costs, it not only reduces the supply of its output to the market, it also reduces its demand for inputs in the factors of production. And that flip side of monopoly power is what I want to emphasize today and talk about how that increase in markups could be a force driving down interest rates. And I'm going to assume, just for the purposes of today, that it's the main driver of interest rates. I don't know that to be true. It's a working hypothesis. If that's the reason interest rates are so low, then how do we think about optimal capital accumulation? How do we think about fiscal policy in that environment? And so that's what I want to spend most of today talking about. Now, here's a piece of evidence just to convince you that markups have been rising. This is the citation. This is just a paper that came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the House organ here at Harvard, just a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago. And it's tried to estimate the markup over time, and it showed that we live in an era of much higher markups than we did before. And you can see that this increase in markups coincides fairly well with the decline in interest rates that I showed you earlier. So this, I think, at least raises the possibility that these two phenomena go hand in hand. And it's worth thinking about how markups, interest rates, capital accumulation, and government debt might all sort of fit together. Okay, so for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot. I'm going to get a little even nerdy argue than I have been. I'm going to sort of try to walk you through parts of a recent working paper I have with my frequent co-author Larry Ball, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins. It's available both on my Harvard website and at the NBER. It's called Market Power in Neoclassical Growth Models. And what this paper tries to do is it tries to redo some kind of classic growth theory while including market power. If you think of sort of the growth models that you've studied, my guess is market power did not play a big role in the benchmark cases. So I don't know exactly your syllabuses, but I'm guessing that a lot of you have seen the Solow Growth Model in one of your, say, intermediate macro classes. So if you've seen the Solow Growth Model, it probably wasn't meant, they didn't talk about it explicitly, but implicit in that is a model of competitive goods markets and competitive factor markets. And so one thing I want to do today is walk you through what the Solow Growth Model is going to look like with market power. And we'll sort of redo some of the conclusions of the Solow Growth Model in a world where firms have markups of prices over marginal cost. The other thing that our paper does is it looks at a second classical growth model, and that's the diamond overlapping generations model, which some of you might have seen. It's a little more advanced than the Solow model. And the paper sort of looks at how do you put market power into that model and what the implications are. I won't have time to cover that part of the paper, but I'll hint at a little bit of what some of the conclusions are. So today I'm really going to focus on how do you adopt the Solow model for market power. Okay, so those are the two classical growth models, Solow model, the diamond model. Those are the two I'm going to look at. I'm just going to add firms with market power. Oh, one thing I should say throughout this is I'm going to assume certainty. These are certainty models. I think there's a lot of interesting work on the question of how do you think about interest rates in the context of uncertainty, because uncertainty tends to drive down safe interest rates relative to risky rates on like capital. I've written out some other papers on that, but you can't do everything in one paper or one lecture. So today I'm going to put aside uncertainty, but for sure I think uncertainty is important. And the final resolution of all the questions that I'm interested in is going to be sort of a combination of some of the things I'm talking about today and some of the things I talked about in some of these other papers that emphasize uncertainty. Okay, so I'm going to now sort of dive down and I'm going to inundate you with economic geek and a bunch of equations. And so I'm going to walk you through really a Solow growth model, but I'm going to think about how to include market power. And because I need to think about market power in the Solow growth model, I'm going to be much more explicit than Solow was about what's going on with the individual firms in the Solow economy. So I'm going to assume there are n firms, and I'm going to assume that production in this economy takes place with 1 unit of a capital labor composite plus alpha units of intermediate goods. So we're going to have intermediate goods in this model. That's not crucial for anything I'm going to say today. So alpha can be set to 0 for most of the things I want to say today. When we want to turn to calibrate the model, I think alpha is going to be important because in the world there really are intermediate goods. Firms buy from each other. And that matters because if one firm is marking up prices and then selling it to another firm, which is turn marking up prices again, that's going to lead to sometimes called double marginalization, which firms get mark up on other firms, and that's going to matter. So intermediate goods interacts with markups in important ways empirically. The basic theoretical insight, setting alpha to 0 would be fine, but when I turn to calibrate, I like alpha to be there. And in the world, by the way, alpha is about a half, which means half of inputs of the typical firm are actually outputs of other firms. Okay, we're going to assume this capital labor composite is going to be a function of K and L, and alpha A here is the rate of is a level of technology, which is going to grow at some rate G. This is very familiar from Solow with one difference. The difference is that this thing X, and X here is going to be a fixed cost. And the reason we want to have a fixed cost is if you're going to have markups, and if you have sizable markups and no increasing returns, then you're going to have a lot of pure profits in the economy. And we want to allow for the possibility that firms in this economy have increasing returns and therefore don't have these fixed costs, and therefore they don't necessarily have huge economic profits, despite the fact that markups can be big. So we'll in fact allow for the possibility that economic profit is 0, but we'll actually calibrate that because while the prices are marked up over marginal cost, firms also bear these fixed costs. So here's price is a markup over marginal cost, and this is gamma, our markup. I'm going to just assume that gamma is exogenously fixed, right? Gamma is equal to 1 in the Solow model, and I'm going to assume it could be 1, but it's probably bigger than 1. And what's marginal cost? Marginal cost here, it involves 2 terms. This part of marginal cost is the intermediate goods you're buying. You're buying to produce a unit of output. You need other firms' output, but you also need this composite. So you're basically taking capital and labor and combining it with intermediate goods. Again, you can set this equal to 0. And if you set this equal to 0, you see the very familiar that marginal cost is equal to the factor price, which is ours, is the rental price of capital, divided by the marginal product of capital. So this is just a very familiar definition of what's marginal cost, just the price of an input divided by the marginal product of that input. And so this is marginal cost in this economy. So you can see here that if price is the markup of marginal cost, and marginal cost depends on this marginal product, you see this gamma is going to give you a wedge between prices and marginal products. And we'll see that in a second. And we're going to assume symmetry of all the firms. So there's n firms, but they're all kind of the same. And all firms are buying from every other firm. So the price of any given firm is the same as the overall price level. And therefore, you can basically do some math, which I won't drag you through, that basically shows that the overall price level is a markup over this marginal cost. But the marginal cost here is now gamma divided by 1 minus gamma alpha. And this 1 minus gamma alpha part has to do this double marginalization I talked about earlier. So that firms, when they're buying intermediate goods, are also marking up their intermediate goods. And that means that there's sort of markups on top of markups. And that sort of makes the economy-wide markup, which is this thing, larger than the individual firm's markup. And we will call this mu. So so gamma is the individual firm's markup over its marginal cost, but mu is the economy-wide markup, taking into account that firms are buying intermediate goods in a network with other firms. And this is why I think this is important, is because I think gamma is probably not that big, but because alpha is pretty big, mu is going to be much bigger. So the economy-wide markup is going to be much bigger than the markup for individual firms. You can define the economy's value added in this economy, which is just which is this. And again, if there weren't these intermediate goods, alpha 0, and you just have just value added equals output. But in the presence of intermediate goods, you have to sort of net out the intermediate goods to compute value added. So Q represents sort of gross output of all the firms, and Y represents value added. And these things are different only in the presence of intermediate goods, which the Solow model basically assumes away. In this economy, because there's markups, firms are going to earn some pure economic profit. So they're going to hire some capital at rate R, and then hire some labor at rate W, and this here is going to be their pure economic profit as a share of value added. And you can just basically do some algebra, which I won't drag you through, that basically shows you that this profit share, this pure profit share, is going to depend on 2 things. It's going to depend on how big this markup is, and so the bigger the markup, the bigger the profit share. It's also going to depend on how big these fixed costs are relative to the size of the labor force, L, where this fee is just is the labor share. So here you see that profit could be very big, but doesn't have to be, because this X is going to offset the effects on pure profits of these markups. Okay, as in a sort of a standard Solow growth model, there's going to be an arbitrage that links the cost of capital with the rental price of capital. So delta is the depreciation rate of capital, P is the price of buying a unit of output, which includes a unit of capital, and R is the real interest rate. And therefore, R plus delta times P, this is the user cost of capital, and that's got to be equal to the rental price of capital in equilibrium. That's a sort of standard result that you get even in a competitive model. That's true here as well. But it implies something slightly different here, because in the presence of a markup, we now get this formula. Normally, if mu is equal to 1, there's no markup. You basically get the real interest rate equals the marginal product of capital net of depreciation. So the marginal product of capital and the real interest rate are basically the same in a sort of a Solow model with no markups. In this model, however, what you see is that there's a markup is bigger than 1, mu is bigger than 1. But we're going to calibrate it about 1.5 later. And as a result, that's going to tend to depress the real interest rate for any given marginal product of capital. So this is the important wedge, that it's this mu here is the important wedge that's going to sort of drive everything in this extended Solow model. So now to go back from the individual firm to the overall economy, I'm going to assume that the number of firms in the economy is proportional to the labor force. And therefore, the size of the firm, even as the labor force grows, the size of the firms won't grow. There'll be more and more of them. You can then define the overall value add in this economy as we did earlier. And this, of course, this includes the markup, the intermediate goods, and the fixed costs in the form of X. And you can write, as you would with the Solow model, output per worker, little y, as a function of little k, capital per worker. And this is exactly the same function you've seen in the Solow model, but except you have this extra term floating around due to the presence of fixed costs. The capital accumulation equation is exactly the same as you're familiar with in the Solow model, where capital is accumulated because we save a certain fraction of income, with exogenous saving rate S. And this is what in my textbook I call break-even investment. It's investment due to depreciation, but also because population is growing at rate N, technology is growing at rate G, and you need to equip new workers and new effective workers with the capital stock. And so this is, again, standard steady state condition that for those of you who studied the Solow model in a class will have seen before. Now, what I'm interested in thinking about is what's optimal capital accumulation in this model. Famous Phelps paper in the 1960s said we should think about capital accumulation in terms of what he called the golden rule, which is what level of capital, there's what steady state in the Solow model maximizes consumption. And consumption in steady state is output minus the investment you need to replace depreciation and to equip new workers. And so the golden rule is the case where the net marginal product of capital equals the growth rate of the economy. This is a very familiar condition. This goes back really to the 1960s to Ned Phelps. The question becomes, how do you measure the net marginal product of capital in this economy? In particular, can you use real interest rates? Well, in the conditions that Phelps looked at, you could. Phelps assumed certainty, as we're assuming, and he assumed competition, which we're not. Under the case of certainty and competition, you get the real interest rate equals the net marginal product of capital, and therefore you can use the net marginal product of capital to decide whether you need more or less of it. And you can look at the real interest rate. And that's sort of the logic that pervades, say, Summers and Furman when they were saying, oh, we don't really need to worry about capital accumulation, because after all, interest rates are zero, capital doesn't have much value at the margin. But that's not true in this model. In this model with a markup, it's no longer true that the real interest rate equals the marginal product of capital because of this wedge. And you see that wedge is being driven by the markup mu. And so the interest rate's being driven for any given marginal product of capital, for any given f prime, the real interest rate's going to be driven down the higher mu is. And so that drift upward in mu should be driving down the real interest rate if you believe those previous empirical estimates that markups are rising. Another thing you might look at, some of the literature looks at, is to look at the profit, the earnings per unit of capital. This is earnings per unit of capital. This is net earnings. So this is what capital's paid minus depreciation. And of course, profits show up in earnings of capital, since capital owners typically get the economic profits. And so this is here sort of what we measure earnings per unit of capital. But this is also an imperfect measure of the marginal product of capital for two reasons. One is you have these profits that are driving up the marginal product of capital because driving up the measured marginal product of capital, measured M, and you have also this mu that goes in the other direction. So even this measure, you're looking at earnings per unit of capital, is not necessarily a useful way to judge whether we have more or less capital than the optimal level. There's more or less capital on what Phelps called the golden rule level. So there are two different biases pushing in different directions. And so it's not clear how you interpret M. But this is what the paper shows, that while there are biases in M, there are correctable biases. In particular, there's two things you can correct them with. One is mu that we saw earlier, and the other is Tobin's Q. And if you recall from Tobin's Q is the market value of the capital stock divided by its replacement cost. And here in this model, you can compute that Tobin's Q is 1, just what Tobin thought the benchmark was, plus the discounted value of profits in the economy. And so the more profits there are, the higher Q is going to be. And so therefore, what you can do is you can estimate the net marginal product of capital in this way. You can get an estimate of M, the earnings per unit of capital, and then use some estimate of the markup and some estimate of Tobin's Q to try to infer what M is. Okay, so that's the theory. What the paper then tries to do is tries to do a calibration to the US economy. It says, okay, let's go to the data in the US economy and see, let's kind of match this sort of extended Solow model to the US economy. And what do we get? Well, here are the parameters that we need. One is the capital output ratio, which is pretty easy to measure. We're going to assume that's 3. We need to measure the depreciation rate, and depreciation is about 15% of GDP. And that's, again, just from national income accounts. We need an estimate of the capital share or the labor share, and that's about 1/3, 2/3. That's sort of the famous Cobb-Douglas rule of thumb. I want to assume the growth rate of technological progress is 2% per year. That's roughly the rate of per capita income growth over the long haul. I'm going to assume that intermediate goods share of revenue is about 1/2, and that's, again, something that's fairly easy measured. And typically, a firm in the US economy, intermediate shares are about 1/2. And I'm going to assume that Tobin's Q is about 2, which is about what it is right now in the United States. And I'm finding, and this is the hardest part, this is the hardest number to estimate. I'm going to assume that the typical firm in the economy has a markup of 20% over its marginal costs. And I got this, that's sort of consistent with the literature, although the literature is not really good at pinning this down. I got this number by calling my favorite industrial organization economist, Mike Winston, at MIT, and asking him what's the good number to use, and he said 20%, so that's how we picked it. Okay, so here are the results. I'll just go through these quickly since I'm running out of time. I'd really love to take questions. The economy-wide markup is about 50%. That's because of intermediate goods. The real interest rate calibrated to those numbers is about 4%, but notice the marginal product of capitals is 8.5%. So that means that the value of capital is about 4.5 percentage points per year higher than an estimate of the real interest rate. So capital is really much more valuable than you'd infer looking at the interest rate in this economy. Pure profits are about 6% of GDP or 3% of gross revenue. And overhead labor is about 41% of total labor, or about 14% of gross firm revenue. So what do we conclude from that calibration? One is that you really can't infer the marginal product of capital from data on the real interest rate. Because of plausible markups, there's a very big gap between the value of capital at the margin and what you might infer from looking at interest rates. And in particular, the marginal product of capital is well above the economy's growth rate, meaning that we have less capital than what Phelps called the golden rule. And therefore, more capital is still valuable to the economy's steady state at the margin. And I won't talk about the sensitivity results in the paper. A second part of the paper looks at the diamond overlapping generations model. Just to give you a very quick overview of what that does, is it basically says, again, it confirms the result that when we have market power, the low rate of return earned by savers does not reflect the net marginal product of capital. So that result from the Solow model carries over exactly into the diamond framework. When interest rates are sufficiently low, as they are now, the government can issue lots of debt. It can basically run a Ponzi scheme. It can roll over debt forever. So really, government debt is not costly from a budgetary standpoint. But even so, it crowds out capital and could still depress living standards. So even if the government can run a Ponzi scheme, that doesn't mean it should, because capital is still valuable, and the crowding out that capital, that debt induces, reduces economic welfare in the steady state. Now, what the one thing our paper does not cover, and I sort of mentioned this because maybe we'll talk about it in the Q&A, is there's a lot of implications for a lot of these issues for monetary policy. We're not about monetary policy in this paper, but I think there's a lot of important issues. And those are roughly, what does the lower interest rate mean for nominal interest rates? And in particular, if real interest rates are low, nominal interest rates are going to tend to be low for any given inflation target. That means there's less room for conventional monetary policy, by which I mean just cutting interest rates. And the Fed starts relying more on unconventional monetary policy, like forward guidance and quantitative easing. And there's an interesting question of whether we should think about ways to revive conventional monetary policy in an era of low interest rates. And some people have, particularly my co-author Larry Ball, has argued for raising the inflation target. I once wrote a column for the New York Times talking about how we could basically tax currency or abolish currency and use that as a way to have deeply negative interest rates and therefore revive conventional monetary policy in that way. That's not something I envisioned the Fed actually doing, but it's an interesting hypothetical to think about. And it's an imaginary world that could exist in the future, which I'm happy to spend more time talking about. And that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to try to stop. Actually, can somebody stop sharing slides for me? And we can go back to in person. And thank you. And I'm happy to sort of take questions. And I'm sorry, I went on for a little longer than I wanted, but I'm happy to stick around for a little past the full hour if we have questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Mankiw, for that very, very insightful talk. It was really interesting to hear about your paper on market power and neoclassical growth models and how government debt, interest rates, and markup go together and interact with each other. Now we will be proceeding to the Q&A portion of this event. So first I'm going to ask if there's anyone who wants to ask for a live question. If you do have a question that you would like to ask yourself, feel free to raise your hand now and I can unmute you so you can ask your question yourself.
And I should say, by the way, I'm happy to take questions on anything, not just, it could be about what I just talked about, this paper, but anything that you want to ask about, I'm happy to chat.
Okay.
I have opinions on a lot of things.
Okay, so there is someone. Let me just find. Okay. Yes.
Professor Ravin has a question.
Professor Ravin has a question.
Yeah, I had no, it was very interesting. Two questions. So one, the rise of market power is, do you think of that as a failure of regulation or is it technological? And the other one, so I guess so it's true that if government debt goes up and interest rates remain low, then the debt service is low. But of course, one might think about what would happen in the case that real interest rates were to rise, and whether that is something one should worry about.
Yeah, no, that's right. At some point, yeah, let me take the second question first. Yes, I mean, in the diamond version of the model, as you crowd out capital, I think interest rates would rise. If they rise above, if you put too much government debt and they rise too much, and then the government debt may no longer be sustainable in a Ponzi scheme-like way. I mean, so what we're doing in the paper, in that part of the paper, is we're looking at sort of an incremental, small change in government debt. So to that effect, if you're a little bit of government debt, you can run it forever. But you're absolutely right. If you're a lot of government debt, at some point you drive up interest rates, and then so there may be a limit to how big your Ponzi scheme could be. So your intuition about that is exactly right. On the first question of why do I think we live in a world of high markups? I mean, for one, I view it as very possible, and maybe we don't. I mean, I think there's literature on this thing suggesting we do, but I'm not 100% convinced by it. I think it's at this point it's an interesting hypothesis. There are people who are suggesting it's policy driven, that antitrust has not been active enough. I'm more inclined to think it's actually not being driven as much by that as by technology. Think of things like Facebook, right? I think Facebook is a natural monopoly, and I think mainly for reasons that aren't in our standard textbooks. It's really it's a natural monopoly because of networks, not because of big fixed costs. Although this may have some of that too, but it's really it's a monopoly because of networks. And who wants to be on Facebook if you're the only person in it, right? So you want to be in the same Facebook everybody else is. So I think there's sort of natural monopolies arising from networks, and if that's the reason, then we may just live in a sort of intrinsically in a world of sort of higher markups. And if I had to guess, it's more being driven by that than by policy, but I'm not 100% sure. And I think certainly there's reasonable people to disagree. And interestingly, from a policy standpoint, the Biden administration hasn't done a lot yet, but they came in promising to be more aggressive in antitrust enforcement than recent administrations are. So we'll see if that happens. I mean, things like, I mean, some of it's been driven by non-economic things, like the whole effects of Facebook on the political dynamic in this country, which has not been that healthy. But some of it's just driven by things like Amazon, who just has a lot of market power, and some people think they've been abusing it.
Okay, thank you for that question, Professor Raman, and for your answer, Professor Mankiw. Now, if anyone else from the attendees have a live question that they would like to ask, you can raise your hands now and we can unmute you and allow you to talk. If not, we will be continuing to the Q&A questions that we have on the Q&A portion. Okay. Now, since there's none, we'll be going towards the Q&A questions that have been submitted. First, we have from Raphael. What do you think about the argument that interest rates are maintained at an artificially low level by the central bank's intervention?
Yeah, I think that's true in the short run, but I think if you think of the long-term trend, I think it's better. If you're looking at like a 40-year trend, which I showed you at the beginning of this seminar, I think you better think about that in a world where monetary policy is not really the primary driving force. I am a big believer in the classical dichotomy, which is that in the short run, monetary policy has powerful effects on real variables like real interest rates, but in the long run, over which prices are flexible, real variables are determined by real forces, and monetary policy is relatively neutral. So in terms of thinking like what's happening at this very moment, for sure, what the Fed and other central banks are doing is of tremendous importance. If you want to think about the 40-year trend decline, which is what I was more interested in than the absolute current events, then I think monetary policy is not the key, and therefore we need to sort of think about more fundamental structural things about the economy. It could be fiscal policy, it could be changes in saving and investment behavior, but it's not primarily about monetary issues.
Okay, I actually have my own question as well that I would like to ask. So research has found that economic shocks have disproportionately affected vulnerable groups, raising renewed concerns about inequality in food, housing, and others, and financial insecurity. So how can macroeconomic policy be adjusted to address growing inequalities, especially during times of recession, given that QE has always been criticized for increasing inequality further than the shock itself did?
I mean, I think, let me end with, let me start with the last comment about QE. You're right. Monetary policy in general, which works through lowering interest rates, will tend to push up valuations on all assets, and therefore, and assets tend to be held by wealthy people, and therefore it's tend to increase wealth inequality. So that's I think that's probably an inevitable feature of monetary policy. That's not what the central bank's thinking about while it's doing monetary policy. It's trying to go back to full employment. And so while it will have ramifications for inequality, it's probably that probably should be foremost in its mind. I mean, we give central banks the charge to worry about price stability and full employment, and I think giving them a third charge, worrying about inequality, I think is probably too much to ask for for an institution that has relatively limited set of tools. So while you're absolutely right that it has implications for inequality, those probably shouldn't be foremost in central bankers' mind. In terms of whether shocks have disproportionately affected the vulnerable, yeah, that's sometimes true and sometimes not. Let me tell you sort of what was I think it's a slightly amusing story. But when Alan Greenspan in the 1970s was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, he was testifying in front of Congress, and this was the roughly 74 recession, and some congressmen basically asked Greenspan, said, Greenspan, do you recognize that this recession is disproportionately hurting the poor? And Greenspan said, well, actually said, is it actually, Congressman, I've looked at the data on income by occupation, and it turns out that the group that's being disproportionately affected the worst is actually stockbrokers. Because the stock market was way down and commissions were way down for stockbrokers. And so I have no doubt that Alan Greenspan was right. It turned out to be a very politically inexpedient thing to say, because people weren't particularly worried about the harm of stockbrokers, who are paid a lot, and even if the income was disproportionately fell more, they probably didn't suffer as much as the poor, right? Probably my guess is a 60% decline in stockbroker income is not as hard as a 30% decline in the decline of, for say, a janitor's income. So I think, well, so it's probably, I don't know if it's always the case that they're disproportionately hurt the worst, but I think it's certainly more, whatever the income declines they experience is probably more difficult to handle, just because they start off at a low level of standard of living. This raises the general question of what sort of social safety net should we have. I'm somewhat sympathetic to what is now called the universal basic income, which used to be called the negative income tax in the economics profession. It's an idea that I first read about in Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom, which was published in 1962. I read about it when I was a student in the 1970s. So the idea has been floating around a long time. I'm sympathetic to it. Interestingly, the Biden administration has proposed a small version of that in the form of a child tax credit, which basically provides a negative income tax or a universal basic income for families with children. So it has a UBI-like feature. It's controversial politically, and it's controversial because different people feel differently about how do you feel like supporting someone who is not working and perhaps not looking for work. So, like Senator Manchin has basically said he wants the child credit to have work requirements, associated with it. You have to be working to qualify. He doesn't like the idea of just giving people money who aren't even looking for work, and he wants to have work requirements. And that's partly an economic question and partly a philosophical question. How do you feel about public policy supporting people who aren't trying to support themselves? And there's an economic question of how many people are there of such variety. But I think there's certainly some, and I think different people have different views about that. It doesn't bother me particularly. So that's why I tend to be in favor of universal basic income. But that's why we don't have something like that in the United States as well. I think some people find it's objectionable to find people who aren't working. There's a fascinating paper came out recently by Michael Golosoff and some co-authors he recently presented at Harvard that tries to estimate the effect of a universal basic income on personal earnings. And he and his co-authors do this by studying data on lottery winners. And so what they find is that by studying data on lottery winners, that for every dollar a person earns, so basically take your lottery winners and sort of amortize it, and so you're getting $1 a year for over the next number of years. For every dollar your income goes up because of being a lottery winner, your personal earnings from working goes down by I believe it was 40 cents. So people spend. So it does something like a universal basic income would significantly reduce people's work effort and earnings. And then the question becomes: is that a big enough effect for you to not like a universal basic income or not? And that's a judgment call. I think goes beyond sheer economics. But I think having something like a universal basic income would probably have some effects of some people dropping out of the labor force and reducing the hours that they work.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question that was submitted through Instagram. It's asking, while serving as an advisor to Bush, what was the most important policy you spearheaded?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't, I had my fingers in lots of different pies, most of which never saw the light of day. So, for example, there was talk. I mean, George Bush was interested in something. I mean, to give you one that really got really very no public attention at all. George Bush was interested in nuclear power. He had the sense that nuclear power had been disadvantaged in the United States through excessive regulatory burdens, and I spent a lot of time, worrying about that. Was that really the case? In the end of the day, we decided it really wasn't the case. That it was excessive. There might have been some excessive regulatory burdens, but the reason we didn't have more nuclear power generation in the United States was not that, but rather that it actually turned out not to be very cost effective compared to the alternatives at the time. And the people who were trying to, the people in the industry who were trying to push for nuclear power, basically wanted the federal government to give them huge subsidies. And we decided against providing huge subsidies to nuclear power. We're perfectly happy to reduce the regulatory burden, but if they weren't going to start anything putting their own capital at risk, if they really wanted the federal government to subsidize it, the Bush administration decided not to do that. So it was one of those things that I was involved with that sort of got no attention at all because it ended up not being a policy. One thing I was involved with a little more publicly, that was mentioned earlier by Morton, was I was involved in an attempt to try to regulate Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we recognized these government-sponsored enterprises were really in a position where they weren't a safe part of the financial system. We didn't appreciate that we were about to have a financial crisis in 2008, and so I was there back in 2005, and so 3 years beforehand we weren't seeing a financial crisis on the horizon. We kind of realized that the whole setup of these government-sponsored enterprises, where the stockholders got the upside and the government got the downside, was kind of an untenable institution. And so we tried to come up with a stronger regulator for these institutions, and we failed at that. And I gave some speeches about that, and that was a very public attempt by the Bush administration. We were failed because some of the Democrats in Congress thought we were not sufficiently sympathetic to low-income people trying to buy their first homes. Because one of the things that a better regulator might have done is it might have said, well, we don't need to make these high-risk loans to these people who have small down payments, say, and that would have made it harder for relatively low-income, low-wealth people to buy their first homes. And so the Democrats who stopped this, coincidentally, Barney Frank, who was my congressman at the time, as chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, he basically stopped this because he said, look, we don't want to reduce the supply of mortgages to low-income families. 3 years later, I think everybody came to appreciate that maybe too many low-income families had gotten mortgages with too small down payments, and that's one of the things that contributed to the financial crisis. But back in 2005, that was not front and center on people's minds.
Okay, great. We have another question from Tony and Daniel. So, what is your opinion on current and future economic situation in China and the US? Is there room for free trade economists in policy if trade with China, for example, is deemed to be primarily an issue of national security rather than economics?
Yeah, it is one of the I mean, whenever I cover sort of the economics of free trade, I then have to hear a bunch of arguments that might be right in principle, but you got to be careful in applying them in practice for restricting trade. And one of them is the national security argument. So there are, I think, legitimate national security issues involved with trade, in particular trade of somebody who's a geopolitical adversary. I think we should be very careful in applying it because it can often be abused. And so when in hearing about the case for trade restrictions and on national security grounds, I'd rather hear from the generals and rather hear than for the domestic competitors. Because it's often the domestic competitors that are invoking the argument and not the generals. So, and the domestic competitors may have an agenda that's different from the generals. I think we have some serious issues with China. My own view is that the issues are not often that are emphasized in the political process are not often the right ones. One that's emphasized by almost every president in recent history. I don't think the Biden administration has talked about this yet, but certainly the past 3 presidents has talked about this, is the exchange rate. You know, there are people unhappy about China using its exchange rate policy to get an advantage in U.S. markets. I tried to argue this even internally when I was in the Bush administration, but I thought the exchange rate issue was widely overblown and not nearly as important as presidents seem to think it is. I think the 2 issues that are probably more important are, one, climate change. And climate change is intrinsically a global phenomenon, and therefore we can't really do it without the rest of the world. So, and China is a big part of the rest of the world, so we can't do it without China. And so therefore I think climate change is one of those things where coordination with China is very important. And the other thing that I think is very important, perhaps not as existential as climate change, is intellectual property protection, where the United States and Western Europe produces a lot of intellectual property, whether it's movies or pharmaceuticals or even textbooks that's sold around the world. And it's pretty clear that intellectual property is not well respected in China. There's a lot of people making bootleg copies of software and so on. And what that basically means is that the producers of that software, Microsoft say, aren't fully compensated for what they're producing. And that's a problem if you're a knowledge-intensive economy, like a lot of developed economies are. So I think, in my view, in terms of dealing with China, thinking about climate change and intellectual property protection is important. Exchange rates seem to be relatively minor. And then, of course, there's all sorts of general political issues, which is that we would like to promote democracy and freedoms around the world. China's an authoritarian government. To what extent should that impinge on our economic relations? And that's really a hard question. Since it's above my pay grade, it's really not an economic question. It's a geopolitical question. But I think it's something we need to think about as we deal with China.
Okay, thank you. We will be taking one last question. Sorry. This is from Ignacio. He asks, in an article you wrote in 2008, you said that if you needed to talk to only one economist in order to properly understand what caused the 2008 recession and how to anticipate other depressions or recessions, it would be John Maynard Keynes. Do you still think this today, and why?
Well, I still think Keynes is a tremendously important economist because he's the one who gave us the idea of aggregate demand and insufficient aggregate demand as a cause of economic downturns. And I think that's a tremendously important idea. It's sort of I did, as was mentioned earlier, I did earlier work in my career, what's called New Keynesian Economics. And that was really trying to put Keynesian insights on a more solid theoretical foundation to make them sort of more palatable to modern macroeconomists who are more interested in making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed from a theoretical perspective. So I really do believe that John Maynard Keynes remains a very important economist. I don't think the question of insufficient aggregate demand is a problem facing economies right now. I think that the situations we're facing at this moment are different. I think that the pandemic certainly created some declines in aggregate demand, but also created declines in aggregate supply. And arguably, right now, the former is bigger than the declines in aggregate supply are bigger than the declines in aggregate demand, which is why we're seeing inflation going up around the world. We're seeing supply chain interruptions. I don't know what's true in Western Europe, but in the United States labor market, there's all sorts of signs of shortages where we see job openings at very high rates. We see worker quits at very high rates, and that's an indication that workers think they can get new jobs. You don't tend not to quit unless you think you can get a new job quickly. So we see all sorts of macroeconomic measures that suggest that we're not finding insufficiency of aggregate demand. And indeed, I'm worried that we sort of overdid it in the United States with demand expansion. When Biden passed his first bill, shortly after becoming president, he included lots of demand stimulus, just checks to like lots of families, not literally every family, but almost every family got, I forget what it was, $1,400 or so in the mail, including people, my adult children who were like in grad school and stuff. They got checks in the mail. They didn't need it, so it wasn't like as if they were particularly targeting people who were needy. I mean, they certainly were happy to have it, but it wasn't as if it wasn't particularly well targeted. So there's lots of aggregate demand stimulus out there. If you look at sort of measures of liquidity like M2, there's a lot of money sloshing around the economy. So people basically took their stimulus checks, they stuck them in their bank account, and so checking accounts are really high. So insufficiency of aggregate demand is an important thing in some economic downturns. That's not the problem facing the economy right now, but it'll happen again. So at some point, we'll have another recession, and John Maynard Keynes will be relevant again. It's just not irrelevant at this particular moment in history.
Okay, so thank you for that, Professor Mankiw. Apologies to those people who did not have their questions answered during the event. This brings us to the end of the session. A big thank you from the Economist Society and the UCL Department of Economics to Professor Mankiw for taking out the time from your busy schedule to come and speak with us. We hope you enjoyed the event. Thank you also to Professor Ravin for being here with us as well. And finally, thank you to the attendees for being such a great audience and for all the questions that you've asked. We have many more events coming up this week for the Economics Conference of UCL for 2021, with Darren Acemoglu giving a talk on automation and the inappropriateness of 21st century technology tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. For more content and information regarding our events, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. We hope to see you there. So now I will end the event. So thank you everyone.
Stephanie.
Thank you, Professor Mankiw.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.